All right, that was kind of a perfect setup for me. Yeah. Sounds good, sounds good. Okay, so yeah, I think we are just a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to try to blast through my slides as quickly as possible, but I will have them available online, and I'll tweet those out so you can get them, and I think maybe the organizers are going to try to make everything available as well. My talk, the unrealized role of monitoring and alerting. I've already been up here before, but for those of you who maybe weren't in here, I'm Jason Hand, DevOps evangelist at VictorOps. VictorOps is an on-call and incident management platform. That's all I'm really going to say about that. Follow me on Twitter. If you hear anything, see anything that you like, feel free to put it out on the Twitters for everybody else to learn about it and share it too. So just to set a little bit of a sort of context, to set the stage for what this talk is about. Earlier this year, I think it was like late January, early February or something like that, I was out in Pasadena at the Scale conference, which, does anybody ever go to Scale? The systems, yeah, Linux, there's a couple hands. Great conference. I got to go out there. I was part of a panel about monitoring and alerting and sort of like what's the best practices, why do we do this kind of thing. And throughout that discussion on that panel, there was a couple of people who I felt sort of steamrolled the conversation. They came from a service that was more monitoring. I come from more the on-call, the alerting things and what happens after the monitoring aspect. But they were adamant that the only reason why we do monitoring at all is really to prevent system failure, to predict things that are going to happen, look for trends that may sort of indicate that there's going to be a failure. And that is really the only reason why we do any kind of monitoring at all. And I took the stance that, well, that's important. Of course, we want to keep an eye on things. There's actually a lot more to monitoring, especially when you combine monitoring and alerting. And if you only take the tack that it's really just there to prevent things, you're maybe not seeing the full value of those tools that you use, and you're likely paying a lot of money for them. And so anyway, I went home from this conference, and I was a little disgruntled, and I spent a lot of time sort of searching online to see if I could find some evidence to kind of back up my own feelings, my own thoughts and feels about this thing. And I'm sure most of us have felt this way at some point. But I came across, actually I'd seen it before, but I came across the 2015 monitoring survey. James Turnbull he does this survey every year, and asks a ton of people in our industry, like, what is it about monitoring, why do you do monitoring, and what type of monitoring tools do you use, what do you monitor, and all kinds of great stuff. So I thought, this might be the perfect sort of resource to help me make my argument on, maybe there's more to this monitoring and alerting stuff. So I started digging into the results, and the first thing I looked at that caught my eye was, first of all, who is responding to this survey at all? And of course, right there, you see the biggest one, operations. Those are the main people that were responding to the survey, so they're probably the main people who are doing monitoring at all. Following that is the DevOps group. And then to my delight, I see managers in there, which is kind of interesting and I guess promising. And then you see development. The developers are in there and they're doing some monitoring. That's also, I think, sort of an indicator that a lot of teams are starting to do monitoring and metrics-driven development, which is super important. But I was a little disappointed that I see the architect group down there, and they're not really part of monitoring. And I'd like to see the development a little bit higher as well. So I'm starting to see some things that sort of maybe were really more symptoms, or at least signs of symptoms, rather than something that was backing up my case. So then I dug in a little bit more, and I saw this one question that I thought might be, the closest thing to sort of help me understand. And I was a little disappointed that there wasn't another option in here in terms of what you could choose from. But when you got through this survey, you could choose from multiple of them. Are you monitoring for performance analysis and trending, fault and anomaly detection, capacity planning, A/B testing, or are you not monitoring at all? And the results were this. According to the 2015 monitoring survey, most companies leverage metrics from monitoring and logging purely for performance analytics and trending. If high availability and reliability are important, they also leverage metrics to alert on fault and anomaly detection. And of course, capacity planning kind of helps my argument just a little bit, but really doesn't really fully speak to sort of my argument. And I think a lot of this is because we are really focused on uptime. A lot of us have service level agreements, and I could stand up here for another 30-minute talk and just go off about how SLAs are really kind of in today's complex environments and the things that we're building, SLAs really are more of a hindrance than anything, but that's another talk for another day. But the results of the survey, for the most part, I thought told me that most are using monitoring and alerting to provide uptime and availability. And with a focus on uptime and availability, extra attention was put towards efforts to identify problems before the users do, which obviously nobody's going to disagree that that's not important. But prediction and prevention of disruptions becomes central to all of our actions. And this is where I start to have take a little bit of an issue with this. And the reason is that metrics are primarily only used for context to keep things running or to put services back to quote-unquote normal. And so a lot of us start to maybe take on the role or sort of the image of highly paid or highly schooled technicians and sort of maintenance people, or maybe even more like firefighters. This is the type of stuff that we feel like we're just doing all the time, is just putting out fires. Especially those who either are ops or maybe you are in development and you have started taking on the role of being on call. And all of that's for sure important. Like don't want to get the message crossed here that I say that that's not important. It certainly is important. But my problem with this is that it's still a little bit too old view. It's the old view perspective on the purpose of monitoring, logging, and alerting that leaves the value of those tools and the people that are using those tools, I think, a little bit sort of unrealized or unutilized. Providing high availability is important, but it's by no means the highest priority of the organization, and certainly not the highest priority of IT when you think about all the different groups that are within IT. So what about the organization? Doesn't it need more than just keeping things going? Doesn't it need more than just sort of keeping the lights on? Doesn't it need more than just sort of keeping the status quo? If we're just trying to keep things from breaking or trying to keep things sort of as is that really scalable over the long run? And how does that apply to what the business needs are? Well, the problem is that it fails to address more of what is important to the organization. The objectives of the business should be at the top of every team's list of priorities, including IT. And I think that's a thing that the DevOps sort of principles are trying to highlight and trying to bubble up to the surface, is that we don't need to be so isolated. We don't need to have differing and conflicting responsibilities and objectives. We have to start thinking about what the business needs are and what the end users are, the customers. What are their goals? What are the things that they want? And so if you start thinking in those terms, obviously the first thing that a company needs or company wants is to maintain happy customers. They want to maintain those customers that they already have. They want to keep those people happy. The customers always come first. We've all probably heard the saying that it's easier to keep a customer than it is to earn a new customer. So that's why I think there's been a shift in focus that these days, especially through the DevOps movement, that we need to start making those more of a priority. And the thing is, for sure our customers, the users, they do expect availability. They expect that when they go to use Facebook, they go to use Twitter, they go to use your banking app or whatever it is, they expect for it to work. But there's a lot more to it. So what else are we missing here as IT professionals? What are we not really paying attention to? Think about some of the reasons you've maybe switched from one service provider or a tool to another. Sometimes it is because that service just wasn't reliable, it's coming down too often, but other times it's a little bit more complex. You're not really maybe seeing new features, you're not seeing some innovation, you're not seeing the things that you want to see out of a tool that you rely on heavily. Focusing solely on uptime lacks any hope of seeking out innovation or disrupting of the status quo. And we hear this a lot, or VictorOps, we hear this a lot when we bring in new customers, somebody who's been using some other service provider that's been out there and they switch over to us. This is usually one of the big reasons why they start using us, is because they recognize that the tool that they've been using or the service that they've been using for a very long time hasn't come up with anything new. They've been doing the same thing for a long time, and sure, they might be available, they might have high availability and that type of thing, but they're really not providing what they need over time as their own company grows. So this begs the question, what's the question mark here in the South Park's GNOME business plan? Can anybody take any guesses on what we think that this question mark may be in this plan? All right, no? All right, I'll just give it out there. So it's continuous improvement, and this is really at the heart of a lot of the things that we talk about in DevOps, and certainly a lot of the things that we've heard today. In fact, when I go to these conferences and I talk to people, I sometimes, depending on the audience, especially if I feel like they're very new to DevOps, I stop using that word because it's just too distracting. It's too shiny. You ask 5 people what DevOps means and you get 20 different definitions. It's just sometimes a little bit too squishy and we get just a little bit distracted. So I start by saying it's really just more about continuous improvement. And it's continuous improvement across the board. And if you can focus on that, then you're going to start seeing byproducts come, which are really the things that you were after in the first place. So what are some examples of organizations who failed to recognize this idea of continuous improvement and innovation and paying attention to what we should be doing to move forward and make our services better? Well, the first one that comes to mind is pretty easy. Everybody knows Blockbuster was king for a long time. Well, Blockbuster failed to realize that they needed to start looking towards the web and start streaming the videos that they were providing. And guess who came around and completely replaced them? Blockbuster doesn't exist anymore, and Netflix, as we know, is sort of ruling the world with streaming video. Another good example, Kodak. Kodak doesn't exist. They were the king of photography and all things photography forever. And now we use, our phones, of course, but we post those images online through all kinds of services. Kodak could have been the leader in all of that, and they could have still been around if they just would have paid attention and tried to innovate their service and stay ahead of the game. My last example, Borders. I used to love go to Borders. That's where I got all my books, all my tech books, just anything. I'd go to Borders every weekend and go buy a new book. Now we go to Amazon, which, honestly, I kind of enjoy that too. It's nice to just pick out a book and I instantly have it on my Kindle. But again, Borders could have been doing what Amazon does today. If they just would have paid attention, if they just would have allowed their teams, specifically their IT teams, to begin to innovate on what their service and what their company is trying to provide. Rarely is the data from monitoring and alerting used as a method to identify areas of improvement and innovation. Once services have been restored from an incident or an outage, we tend to move on to the next task or fire to put out. And much of this is because of how we've structured our teams. IT has traditionally been seen as a cost center, and ops have had really just this agenda of being resistant to change. Whereas our developers, they're the ones who want to build new things. And so we've had this conflict. The result of that is that we never allow our teams, specifically our IT groups, the opportunity to learn and to improve and to innovate. And that's really the new sort of model, is that we have to allow our IT teams, which is all of you here in this room, we have to allow ourselves and convince upper management that we are the ones who now can innovate the company and actually bring new services to the business and keep us leaders in the market, or try to make ourselves leaders in the market. Making an effort to continuously understand and learn from the innovation our monitoring and alerting tools provide us allows information from the past to drive actions for the future. And this is something that I think is often missed. We do use this information to go back and maybe do some sort of root cause analysis, which I'll talk more about. But often we don't really let it sort of determine what we need to do in the future to make things better. We just sort of think of it of, well, that was bad, what are we going to do to fix it? And then we move on to the next problem. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears real quick here, and then we'll kind of circle back around. Every year, Puppet Labs puts out the State of DevOps report. Everybody familiar with this? Most people, if you haven't read it, you should read this every year when it comes out. It's about the middle of summer or so. Every single year, there's a lot of stuff in here about the mean time to repair, mean time to resolve. Doesn't really matter what you want to call it there, but they always point out how high-performing teams, high-performing organizations are very good at detecting and recovering from problems. Every single year, they have some sort of context in here. And this year, they've started to actually add numbers to it. You can actually, within the context of your own organization, start to calculate the cost of downtime. And for some companies, it's massive. It's in the thousands of dollars per minute. And when you think about the tools and how much storage costs, and it's so cheap these days, the idea that you're not pretty much monitoring and alerting on everything that you should be is really not the best use of sort of budget and that kind of thing. Increasing the time between failures shouldn't be the primary objective anymore. This is something that I know from me, for being in the industry for a long time. This was my goal. When things broke, I wanted to prevent it from breaking again. And we heard in the previous talk that, sure, you still want to go out and try to make it so that this doesn't happen again, but we're talking about a very specific thing. You have to understand that things will break, but I don't want that specific thing to happen again. Or if it does, I want it to have a less of an impact than it previously did. So maybe if we had some sort of regional disruption, we were in AWS West, that whole thing went offline, somehow there's got to be a better way that it's going to have less of an impact to our end users. That's now the new goal. So instead, a focus on reducing the time it takes to recover from failure should be the new aim. Doing so allows for SRE, ops teams, DevOps to find ways to make the system more resilient and adaptable. And then that allows them to actually innovate from there. So historically, this has kind of been us, right? We're Stewie there saying, no, don't touch my stuff. This is my server. You're not allowed in here. But rather than placing focus on protecting the systems and trying to engineer the failure out of them, we now just need to move fast. And we need to, actually focus on recovering from those failures. So we need to move fast, release new features, shorten the feedback loop. We want to focus on continuously repairing systems and engineering for the possibility of failures. Because in a complex system, we now know there will be failure. It's not something that we can try to engineer out of our systems. Is there anyone in here who's never had an incident or an outage in their system that they've built? It just doesn't happen. It's like this thing that we think we can make it happen. One day I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write the perfect system or build the perfect system where it just doesn't happen. But it's not possible. But the good news is, because this right here, this is a reason alone that you just can't keep your systems from going down. But the good news is that from that failure, we can actually build on success. We can start to build new things, new tools, new processes. We can start to educate our teams. We can come up with new ways so that when things fail, it has less of an impact. So in an industry where failure is unavoidable, learning and innovating through feedback loops, like monitoring and alerting, is really our best course of action at this point. And once IT teams have shifted the focus away from mean time between failure and more towards reducing the time it takes to repair from failure, the services that we're building naturally become more resilient and more reliable over time. Has anybody seen this picture? Can you tell which direction that train's going? Is it going away from us or coming towards us? Yeah. Yeah, it's all in how you look at it. Through experimentation, we learn new ways of doing things, like delivering large distributed systems at scale. But the problem is that in order to innovate, in order to do anything cool, anything new, we actually have to change things. And that's sort of the conundrum that we're in, This creates just this interesting conflict between our teams. The company's desire to self-sustain through continuously improving and providing new services and new features comes in direct conflict with the IT team's goals of providing maximum uptime. This is why we're here. This is what DevOps has become and has personified. We have reached this point where we realize we are causing ourselves to slow down. We can't keep up because we've introduced Agile for our software developers, and they're pumping out code faster than we can get it into production and make sure that it's safe and stable. So we have to come up with a new way. Innovation requires change, yet change can result in failure. That's just sort of our new motto. At least at VictorOps, that's something we try to put into the minds of everyone, is that you're not going to run away from failure. You're not going to run away from even, maybe you're going to get lucky and you're not going to have system-wide Sev1 outages, but you're still going to have problems. And it's because of that change, and you have to have that change in order to innovate, in order to make new, better services. I really love that I can sneak Frank Zappa into a talk because I got a minor in history of rock and roll in college, and I took an entire semester on Frank Zappa. He's a fascinating guy, but this is one of my favorite quotes. I use it all the time. But really, I love it because it's just so true about literally everything, everything in life, and it certainly applies to what we're doing. But this type of change, it can be applied to anything: processes, tools, the people, just like we heard before in the talk prior. It could be changes with our company and the team culture. We hear a ton about how a lot of this is team culture. And to be perfectly honest, in order to get some of this stuff to work in your own organizations, you aren't the people who we need to be talking to. It's your bosses and your boss's bosses. Those are the ones that really need to sink their teeth into this stuff. But you have to be the agent of change. You have to go back to your organizations and say, hey, I'm starting to learn about these new things or hear about these new things, and I think we should start looking into it. When an outage occurs, you will absolutely repair and restore services as best you know how. But are you paying attention to the data from the recovery efforts? Are you making an effort to learn from any of that? Are you conducting post-incident analysis of what took place? We heard, a little bit in the prior talk and in some others, postmortems, learning reviews, after-action reports. A lot of that is just language. It's semantics. It doesn't matter what you call it. Now, I do have some problems with root cause analysis, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But it's really, I think that a lot of folks just see that as a checkbox. They're doing that for somebody. They're not really thinking about why we're doing those things in the first place. But the fact is, you have to do some sort of post-incident analysis, and that goes for every type of incident. It doesn't matter how big or small. You want to know what took place during the response. And so when you start to do these post-incident analysis, whatever you want to call them, you need to ask a lot of questions. You want to know who was involved, who was on call, how quickly did they acknowledge, who was pulled in, was there an incident commander, did support have to reach out to customers, did marketing or PR have to go onto Twitter and start telling people, hey, we're working on it, just like you saw in Dave's talk earlier with, or maybe it was the other one, but PR got on for Netflix and put a funny thing up on Twitter. That type of stuff. You want those people, you want to know that was done. You want to hear about everything that took place during an incident, during an outage. What about the context? What were your people seeing during that response? What kinds of graphs were they pulling up? What kind of logs were they digging into? Were there run books that they were also referencing? What about all the alerts that were coming in? Was anything automatically taken care of? One of the things that VictorOps has built in is this idea of automatically sort of healing things. And you need to know that kind of stuff when you're starting to dig into the post-incident analysis. Was anything sort of taken care of automatically, or were our operators expected to do this stuff in the middle of the night, at 3 a.m., all by themselves? All that stuff, we need to detail all of it. Are those conversations captured? Are you using a dedicated chat room or a channel to diagnose and resolve your issues, or are you hopping on a phone bridge? If you are hopping on a phone bridge, is there somebody who's scribing? Is there somebody who's documenting what's said? Because if not, you just siloed an entire conversation during an incident response, and you'll never be able to go back and analyze that. Are operators explaining their options, or are they describing them? Because there's a difference. Is chat ops, is that part of your culture? Are you actually sort of trained now to go into your group chat and talk about what you're doing? Tell everybody what you're seeing, what you're experiencing. If you're not, obviously I highly recommend that. Got the book on chat ops. There's probably more out the table if you haven't gotten one. What about, is there a timeline? Are you able to actually correlate the events and the actions and the conversations in time with what was taking place, using the times from all your different monitoring services? Are you able to actually integrate that in a way so that you know what was taking place? So as I mentioned, I'm a little bit of a I don't know. I've been known for RCA shaming, I guess you could say. I do have problems with root cause analysis, especially the 5 whys analysis, and I guess I'll sort of just dive in rather than get up on a soapbox here. But when something breaks, we're sort of hardwired. I was taught this too in school. We're hardwired to do a root cause analysis. And we want to seek out the one thing that failed. But as we're learning in these complex distributed systems, just anything that's complex at all, there's never one thing. I talked earlier in my Ignite talk about using systems thinking. You have to use systems thinking for pretty much most of what we deal with, because things don't happen in a linear pattern. There isn't really a cause and effect. And the only way you can understand cause and effect in a complex system is retrospectively. That's why we do these postmortems. That's why we do incident analysis in the end, because you couldn't have predicted things. You couldn't have known what was going on. And so, for me, when we start to do these root cause analysis, I joke because really the root cause is our own obsession with a root cause analysis. It's turned into just a checkbox for management. It's turned into this idea of something broke and we're going to do something about it. And in a lot of cases, that's letting someone go, which is horrible. In complex systems, failures are inevitable. We can't really reduce it down to a single root cause. However, it is possible, if you really want to find a root cause, it's possible to deduce that the common cause of a failure is change. And that's what we've already talked about, that change is part of the system. So when you go out and you do this corrective action, and maybe you've determined that your hard disk failed, and what we're going to do to fix this is actually replace the hard disk, okay, that's fine. You made somebody happy, but stop and think. Did you make your system better? Did you make it more resilient? Because in my opinion, and in most other people, I think in our industry, all you did was just put things back the way they were. You didn't actually make things better. You didn't improve anything at all. Another problem I have with the 5 whys is that it leads to blame. When you start asking why, you inherently start to point fingers. And we want to avoid that at all costs. We never want to ask why. We only want to ask how. Okay, how, maybe what, but how is what we really want to get to, because that starts to uncover, exactly what took place. And blaming's the worst, because when we start blaming people, all we really get are subject matter experts that are really, really good at just hiding everything. They won't tell you shit if they think they're going to get in trouble, because their job may be on the line. So that's why we don't do 5 why analysis. That's why I have a huge problem with root cause analysis, because it starts pointing fingers, and the people who actually know how to build and maintain these services, you may actually be thinking about letting them go from their team, and they're the only ones who really know how to maintain these things. So we must believe that our operators are doing the best they can using the system as it is, and that's all that really matters. We have to believe that the system is what has problems, and we need to start improving and innovating on the system. So when you go into these post-incident analysis, you have to make it perfectly clear that the only thing we're here to do is to learn. We're not here to point fingers. We're not even here to find a root cause. We are here to learn about what happened, learn about what we can do to innovate and improve our systems moving forward. So rather than taking this stance of trying to avoid failure, let me just be clear. I'm not saying you sit on the sidelines with a beer and a sandwich and just watch your data center have a total meltdown. What I'm saying is that that's not the main point of this. So just understand that it is okay to fail. Things will fail. You can't prevent it from happening. It's about how you respond to that. So you got to understand the story, know what took place. We kind of already covered that. I'm going to speed through this so we don't take too much more time. Innovation, learning from both the success and the failure. So you got to learn what went well and what went wrong. And that helps you become this learning organization. When we start focusing on, the things that we need to learn, it sets you up to be a learning organization, which is something else that I think too often a lot of companies don't focus on. But the thing about learning isn't really that, just by reading, coming to these conferences, it's not really going to cut it. Learning comes from actual action. So again, I'm going to skip through these, kind of get to some of the main point here. Real good example, I play the dobro guitar. In order to learn that, I bought some books, I looked at some videos on YouTube, but it wasn't really until I put the dang thing in my hand and started playing it and started screwing up and started making mistakes. It's not until you actually start doing something, it's the action that you actually begin to learn something. And so, we go from this idea of, well, we know something, but then we can understand something, but then we learn something. But it's not until you actually do it. You have to have action before you get to that learning phase. So I catch myself, I say, hey, we're here learning a bunch of stuff. Actually, we're not. We're just sort of ingesting a lot of information. Now, you got to take it back and put it into action, and that's when you'll start learning. We'll skip through that. This is from Dave. This is a continuous delivery of thought leadership, I guess. But Dave from earlier, I love this quote that they'll trade some uptime in exchange for innovation any day. So how do you know if you're doing it right? Like I said, the postmortems, what do those look like? Are you actually identifying what took place? Are you focusing on what we can learn from this rather than what's the one thing that broke? That's just a snapshot of like the postmortem report that VictorOps can provide. But the point of all this is that we really have to start shifting our gaze from being maintainers and supporters and firefighters and really back towards, I think in a lot of cases, back towards actually being this learning organization and trying to innovate on the things, the tools, the processes, and everything that we're doing. And if we can do that, if we start focusing on learning and improving and innovating, then we start to see this like increase for everything. We see increased, more resilient systems, less disruptions, the service is generally more reliable, customers are a lot more happy, company is going to be stronger in the market, your stock's going to go up, like everything just starts to fall in place when you start focusing on learning and innovating rather than being these maintenance people. So don't be afraid of the process of, the whole thing all the way through failing and then learning and trying again. And hopefully that's going to lead up to, we'll see, the architects here, the developers, we'll start seeing them being more involved with the monitoring. They'll hopefully start being, the people that are responding to these monitoring surveys every year, and they'll actually be using these tools to learn and innovate. So anyway, kind of wrapping things up here, learning and innovation is the best way to sort of build these resilient systems. And at the end of the day, when you're building these resilient systems, the byproduct of that, the byproduct of a highly resilient system is a highly available system, which is what we were after in the first place. We just took a different tack. So anyway, that's all I got time for. I know I was a little short, we were running a little short on time. But anyway, the unrealized role of monitoring and alerting, at least from my standpoint, a lot of others I know in the space, and certainly VictorOps, is that learning and innovation. We're not really using the tools that we have out there in terms of metrics, monitoring, alerting, logging, all that kind of stuff. We're only using them for a very small part of what they could be leveraged for. So that's all I got. Appreciate your time, and if you got any questions, we'll just chat later. I'll be at the social event, and I'll be around all day tomorrow too.